When India gained its independence in 1947, it wasn't just about political freedom. It was about building a nation from the ground up, with a grand dream of becoming an industrial powerhouse. And the 4 decades that followed, well, they were one of the most ambitious and, frankly, controversial economic experiments of our time. So today, let's get into the story of how India tried to forge its own industrial path, a journey filled with incredible ambition and some really profound challenges.
I mean, just look at this graph. It tells the whole story, doesn't it? It's a total roller coaster. You see this initial surge, just full of optimism. Then a dramatic stall, where things just grind to a halt. And finally, a slow, kind of uncertain climb back. This one line is our roadmap. It's a story of really high hopes, some pretty deep slumps, and in the end, some very hard-won lessons that would change India's economy forever.
So, to really understand this roller coaster ride, we're going to walk through 5 key phases. First, we'll look at the situation India inherited right at independence. Then we'll dive into that bold, state-led push to industrialize. After that, we'll investigate why the whole engine just sputtered out during the era of stagnation. And of course, we have to demystify the infamous License Raj. Finally, we'll look at how the first seeds of real change started to sprout in the 1980s.
Okay, so let's set the scene. What was the starting line for India's industry back in 1947? To put it mildly, the challenge was, well, it was immense.
The numbers here really paint a stark picture. Industry made up a tiny 7% of the entire economy. It provided jobs for an even smaller slice of the population, just 2% of the workforce. And the industry that did exist wasn't very diverse. A whopping 60% of it was just textiles. But maybe the most critical part is this last point. India had to import 90% of its machinery. Think about that. You can't even build your own factories without outside help. This was the foundation they had to build a new nation on.
So faced with that reality, India's new leaders made a really audacious choice. They decided the state itself would be the engine of industrialization, with a laser focus on one thing: building heavy industry from scratch.
And you know what? For a while it worked. It worked spectacularly. Between 1951 and 1967, industry grew at an average clip of 6.3% every single year. This wasn't just growth. It felt like a powerful statement that a new nation was on the move. So, what was the secret sauce here? What was powering this incredible momentum?
Well, the thing is, this was a very specific kind of growth. It was all guided by an economic strategy called the Mahalanobis model. The core idea was simple. To be truly independent, India first needed to build the industries that could build other industries. That's why the real star of the show here was capital goods, the machines that make other machines. And that sector was growing at a mind-boggling 16% a year. The main vehicle for all this? State-owned companies, or as they were known, public sector units, PSUs. They were the heart of the strategy.
And this entire grand economic vision wasn't just a vague idea. It was all laid out in a single, crucial document. What you're seeing here is essentially the blueprint, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. This policy, which built on an earlier one from 1948, would basically define the rules of the game for the Indian economy for decades to come.
The policy pretty much carved up the economy into 3 distinct tiers. Right at the top, you had the core stuff. Think arms, atomic energy. That was exclusively for the state. No one else could touch it. The second tier was for heavy industries. Here, the state would take the lead, but the private sector could help out. And then, the third tier was basically everything else, left to the private sector. But, and this is a big but, it was still heavily regulated and licensed by the government. This was the famous strategy of the state seizing the commanding heights of the economy.
But after that really promising start, something went wrong. That powerful engine of industrial growth, it started to sputter. It began to stall. The period from about the mid-60s all the way to 1980 is often called the era of industrial stagnation.
Remember this number? That impressive 6.3% growth rate that really defined the first chapter of India's industrial story? It was a symbol of progress, of a nation breaking free.
Now, look at this. The growth rate cratered to just 4.1%. For a developing economy, a drop of over 2 percentage points is a huge deal. The momentum was just gone. This sluggish period even got a nickname, the Hindu rate of growth. So the big question on everyone's mind was, why? What happened?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of like a perfect storm. The web of regulations got even tighter, with new laws like the MRTP Act, which was meant to stop big companies from getting too powerful, and the FARA Act, which made it incredibly hard to get foreign currency. Then, to protect small businesses, over 800 different products were reserved exclusively for them, which limited growth and scale. Public investment, the very fuel for the early boom, started to dry up. And as if that wasn't enough, India got hit by a series of external shocks: wars, the global oil crisis, and terrible droughts.
To really truly understand this period of stagnation, we need to zoom in on that complex web of rules and regulations that came to be known as the License Raj.
So what on earth was the License Raj? Put simply, it was a system where you needed government permission, a license, for pretty much everything. Want to start a factory? You need a license. Want to make more of your product than you were first allowed? You need another license. It was this pervasive, complicated maze of red tape.
And the knock-on effects of this system were huge. It created massive imbalances, with about 60% of all licenses going to just a few states. It naturally led to corruption as people tried to get ahead. It meant factories were often running way below their actual capacity because they literally didn't have permission to produce more. And the end result of all that? Low productivity, high costs, and an industrial sector that just wasn't very competitive.
This system also created a really strange problem. I mean, you'd expect a successful small company to grow into a medium-sized one, right? And then maybe into a large one. But in India, that just wasn't happening. Why not? Well, it led to this phenomenon that economists call the missing middle. The Indian economy ended up with tons of tiny little firms and a few very large protected companies. But that crucial middle layer, that dynamic, growing, medium-sized business sector, was almost completely absent. They were just stuck.
And if you're looking for one of the main culprits, here it is, right from the source material. The MRTP Act of 1969, which was designed to stop big industrial houses from expanding too much, had this totally unintended consequence. It actually discouraged companies from growing at all. If getting bigger meant you'd face a mountain of new regulations, a lot of businesses just decided it was easier to stay small. It was a direct cause of that missing middle.
Okay, so after nearly 15 years of stagnation, things started to shift in the 1980s. The government began to recognize the problems and started taking the first, very careful steps towards reform.
And we can go right back to the source notes to see how this started to happen. Here, you can see a pretty clear list of the policy changes that started to trigger a recovery. This wasn't some big bang reform. It was more like a series of small but really significant tweaks.
So what did this thaw actually look like? Well, the government started to slowly get rid of the licensing requirements for some industries. That MRTP Act, the one that stopped companies from growing, had its limit raised in a big way, from 20 crores up to 100 crores, which gave companies a lot more room to expand. Foreign companies were cautiously allowed into some high-tech areas, and, super importantly, the government started investing in infrastructure again.
And the result of these seemingly small changes was anything but small. Industrial growth came roaring back to life, jumping to an average of 7% a year all through the 1980s. It was a really clear signal that even just a little bit of liberalization could have a huge positive impact.
So India ended the 1980s on a high note, back on a path of strong growth. Those early reforms had worked. But the fundamental structure of the License Raj, even though it was weaker, was still there. And that leaves us with one final big question. Was just tinkering with the system going to be enough for the long haul, or was a full-blown economic revolution just around the corner?